In 1950, a logger walked into the woods with 15 tools and brought down trees that had been standing since before the Civil War. No chainsaw, no engine, nothing between him and the wood but steel and a sharp edge. These are the 15 tools he carried. Subscribe before we start. Number 15, caulked boots. Before anything else went on, the boots went on. Heavy leather with steel spikes driven through the soles, called corks in the Pacific Northwest and caulks everywhere else. A logger walked on wet bark, muddy slopes, and floating logs. Without the spikes, his feet slid out from under him the first time he stepped on a green log. The spikes bit into the wood and gave him a grip that rubber couldn't match. Every logger owned a pair, and every logging camp bunkhouse floor was chewed to splinters by the men who wore them indoors because nobody owned a second pair of shoes. Number 14, marking hammer. A hammer-shaped tool with a raised steel brand on the striking face. When a tree was felled and bucked into logs, the hammer was driven into the end grain of each log, stamping the owner's mark into the wood. In a logging operation where multiple owners' timber ended up in the same river drive or on the same rail car, that mark was the only proof of ownership. No mark, no payment at the mill. The stamp had to be deep enough to survive weeks of water, mud, and impact against other logs during transport. Every timber company had its own registered mark, and losing a marking hammer in the woods was like losing a signature stamp. Number 13, log dogs. Large iron staples, each one about 18 inches long with sharpened points on both legs. You drove them into a log with a sledgehammer to pin it in place. A round log on the ground rolls. A round log on a hillside rolls faster. Log dogs locked the log to the ground or to another log so a man could stand on it, saw it, or hew it without it shifting under his feet. They were crude, heavy, and indispensable. 2 log dogs and a sledgehammer turned a rolling hazard into a stable work surface. Number 12, bark spud. A flat steel blade about 4 inches wide on a long wooden handle, shaped like a giant chisel. The logger jammed it under the bark of a felled tree and levered it off in sheets. Bark had to come off before a log could be measured, graded, or milled. Bark left on a log trapped moisture, encouraged rot, and jammed sawmill equipment. The bark spud was the first tool that touched a log after it hit the ground, and on a big old growth fir, the bark could be 6 inches thick. Stripping it was a full day's work on a single tree. Number 11, cruiser's axe. A lightweight single-bit axe with a shorter handle than a felling axe, carried by the timber cruiser. The cruiser was the man who walked the forest before the logging crew arrived. He estimated the board feet of standing timber, marked boundaries, and blazed trails so the crew could find their way in. His axe wasn't for felling, it was for blazing marks on trees, clearing brush, and cutting his way through undergrowth. The cruiser's axe was the lightest tool in the logging operation because the man who carried it walked more miles in a day than anyone else in the crew. Number 10, choker cable. A steel cable about 15 feet long with a bell and a knob on opposite ends. The logger wrapped it around a felled log, threaded the knob through the bell, and pulled it tight. The bell slid freely in one direction and locked in the other, cinching the cable around the log like a noose. The other end hooked to a horse, a steam donkey, or a tractor that dragged the log to the landing. Setting a choker meant crawling under and around logs in thick brush, working fast, and getting clear before the line went taut. The choker setter had the most dangerous ground job in the woods because he worked closest to moving logs and tensioned cables that could snap and whip without warning. Number 9, Pulaski. A combination axe and grub hoe on a single handle. One side chops, the other side digs. A Forest Service ranger named Ed Pulaski built the first one in his own blacksmith shop in 1911. The year after the Great Fire of 1910 burned 3 million acres across Idaho and Montana and killed at least 78 firefighters. Pulaski himself had saved 39 of his 45 men by leading them into an abandoned mine tunnel as the fire overran their position. The tool he built afterward was designed so one man could chop brush and dig fire line without carrying two separate implements. By 1920, the Forest Service was issuing Pulaskis to every wildfire crew in the country. Loggers adopted it for trail clearing, brush removal, and any job in the woods that needed both an edge and a blade in the dirt. Pulaski never patented it. He never received a cent from the Forest Service for the design, and this is the tool that defined the trade. Number 8, double bit axe. Two cutting edges on one head mounted on a straight handle. One edge was kept razor sharp for felling and limbing, ground to a thin profile that sliced through wood fibers with minimal effort. The other edge was left slightly thicker and duller for dirty work, for cutting into bark, hitting knots, chopping near the ground where the blade might catch a rock or a root. The double bit axe gave a logger two tools in one head and let him switch between them by flipping the handle in his hands. This was the tool that defined the American logger, not the saw, the axe. The saw cut the tree down. The axe did everything else. It chopped the undercut that controlled the direction of the fall. It limbed the branches off the trunk after it hit the ground. It split kindling for the cook fire. It drove wedges. It trimmed notches for springboards. A logger's axe was sharpened every night and filed every morning. The edge was maintained with the same attention a surgeon gives a scalpel. Because a dull axe doesn't cut, it bounces, and a bouncing axe in the hands of a tired man is how loggers lost toes. A felling axe weighed 3 to 4 pounds. A double bit head weighed about the same, but distributed the weight evenly on both sides of the handle, which made the swing more balanced and the cut more accurate. Most loggers bought their own heads and hung them on handles they shaped themselves from straight grain hickory. The fit between head and handle was personal. A logger who picked up another man's axe could feel the difference in the first swing. Number 7, pike pole. A wooden pole 12 to 16 feet long with a forged steel spike and a curved hook on the end. The pike pole was the tool of the river drive, the final stage of logging before trucks replaced the water. After logs were skidded to the riverbank, they were rolled in and floated downstream to the mill. The spike pushed a log away from the bank. The hook grabbed it and pulled it toward you. Rivermen walked the banks and waded into the current, steering thousands of logs downstream for miles. When logs jammed against a rock or a bridge, a riverman used the pike pole to find the key log, the one holding the jam together, and lever it free. If the jam broke while he was standing on it, he ran across the shifting logs to shore or he went into the water under them. The pike pole was useless at that point. It was his caulked boots that saved him. Number 6, saw tools. A canvas roll that held the maintenance kit for the crosscut saw, a flat mill file for sharpening the cutting teeth, a raker gauge, a small metal plate that measured whether the raker teeth were set to the correct depth below the cutters, and a joiner for leveling the teeth so every tooth bit at the same height. A cross-cut saw has 2 types of teeth. Cutting teeth score the wood fibers. Raker teeth clear the sawdust from the kerf. If the cutters were dull, the saw dragged. If the rakers were too high, sawdust clogged the cut. If the rakers were too low, the saw chattered and jumped. Sharpening was done every evening in camp. And the man who did it, the saw filer, was one of the highest paid men in the crew because every man's next day depended on the edge he put on the steel. Number 5, peavey, a hardwood handle about 4 feet long with a forged steel spike at the tip and a hinged steel hook mounted near the bottom. The spike dug into the end grain of a log. The hook grabbed the side. Together they gave a single man the leverage to roll a log that weighed a ton. The peavey was invented in 1858 by a blacksmith named Joseph Peavey in Stillwater, Maine, and the basic design hasn't changed since. The cant hook is similar, but has a blunt toe instead of a spike. Loggers used both, but the peavey spike gave it the advantage on frozen logs and icy landings where a blunt toe would slip. Every logger owned one. Every logger cursed the weight of it on the walk in, and every logger was grateful for it the moment a log needed turning. Number 4, wedges and mauls, steel wedges driven into the saw kerf with a heavy sledgehammer called a maul. This is how a logger controlled the direction a tree fell. After the undercut was chopped, the crosscut saw was pulled through the back cut on the opposite side. As the saw moved deeper, wedges were driven into the kerf behind the blade to keep the cut from closing and to push the tree toward the undercut. Without wedges, a tree could settle backward onto the saw and pinch the blade so tight that 2 men couldn't pull it free. With wedges, a faller could lean a 200-foot Douglas fir to within a few degrees of where he wanted it to land. A tree that fell the wrong direction could kill every man standing in the clearing. Number 3, log scale stick, a flat wooden ruler about 3 feet long, calibrated to the Scribner or Doyle log scale. The scaler laid the stick across the sawn end of a log, read the diameter, and the numbers printed on the stick told him how many board feet of lumber were inside. A 12-inch log might scale at 60 board feet. A 36-inch log might scale at 600. The board foot measurement was how timber was bought and sold. The scale stick turned a tree into a number, and the number turned into money at the mill. The scaler was the most important man at the landing because his reading determined what the logger got paid. A generous scale put money in the logger's pocket. A tight scale took it away. Both men looked at the same stick and the same log and somehow came up with different numbers. Number 2, crosscut saw, the misery whip, a steel blade 5 to 7 feet long with a handle on each end, pulled back and forth by 2 men standing on opposite sides of a tree. The cutting teeth scored the wood. The raker teeth cleared the dust from the kerf. One man pulled while the other rested his arms. The rhythm had to be steady. If one man pushed when the other pulled, the blade buckled and jammed. If one man pulled harder than the other, the saw wandered off the cut line. 2 men on a cross cut had to match each other's pace, each other's strength, and each other's breathing for hours at a time. The men who worked them called them misery whips because the work was exactly as bad as the name suggests. A 2-man team could fell a 4-foot tree in about an hour. A chainsaw could do it in 5 minutes. When lightweight chainsaws reached the American logging industry in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the crosscut saw was finished. No tool in the history of logging was abandoned faster or more gratefully. Number 1, springboard, a wooden plank about 5 feet long and 8 inches wide with a steel tip bolted to one end. The tip had an upward-pointing cleat that bit into the wood when weight was applied. The logger chopped a notch into the trunk of the tree, slid the springboard in, and stepped onto it. Now he had a platform to stand on while he worked the axe and the saw. Old-growth trees flare at the base. The butt swell can spread 6 to 10 feet wide, full of resin that gums a saw blade and grain too twisted to cut clean. Springboards let the faller climb above the flare and cut where the trunk was straight. Most notches were 4 to 8 feet off the ground. On the biggest trees, on steep slopes, they went 10 or 12 feet up. Fallers worked in pairs, 1 man on each side of the tree, each on his own springboard. When the tree started to give, they listened for the crack. The moment the trunk moved, both men threw down their tools and used the springboards like diving boards to jump clear before the tree and the root wad came down behind them. The springboard is the most iconic image in American logging. A man standing on a narrow plank jammed into the side of a tree, 100 feet of trunk above him, and nothing but air below. Every old-growth stump in the Pacific Northwest still carries the notches. The boards are gone. The trees are gone. The notches are still there. Every tool on this list was carried into the woods by a man who walked in before dawn and walked out after dark. No cab, no hydraulics, no roll cage, just steel, wood, and the weight of his own arms. The chainsaw and the skidder ended the era, but every board in every house built before 1950 passed through the hands of men who carried these 15 tools. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe and watch the next video above.